Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. What happens when the very people bankrolling a war machine decide that the cost of survival is worse than the cost of speaking out?
It's a huge question.
Right. I mean, imagine you are sitting on top of an industrial empire worth billions. You've got the yachts, the global influence, a golden ticket to the Kremlin's inner circle. And for decades, you've played by one very simple rule, which is keep your mouth shut about politics, and the money just keeps flowing.
Because breaking that rule usually ends with your assets seized.
Or worse, honestly. Yet today, we are looking at an article from The Economist titled The Man Who Had Changed Russia. And it's centered on this completely unprecedented 60 hours of interviews with Andrei Melnichenko.
Yeah, Russia's biggest industrialist.
Exactly, the world's fertilizer king. And for some reason, he has decided to just, grab a megaphone. But real quick, before we really get into the mechanics of what he's saying, just a note for you listening. The topics we are unpacking today, they involve the war in Ukraine, the Russian government, global geopolitics.
Highly charged stuff.
Very. And our goal here isn't to endorse any specific political viewpoint or, take a side on the conflict. We just want to impartially explore the ideas, the arguments, and these pretty startling predictions laid out in this article.
Right, and exploring those predictions means we have to immediately ground our expectations about who is actually talking here.
Yeah, let's talk about Melnichenko.
Because he is not undergoing some sort of sudden moral awakening. We are not looking at a high-minded champion of human rights.
No, that's not.
He's a cold, calculating pragmatist. I mean, his massive factories have actively supported the Russian war economy. He even went back to Russia in 2023.
Right, because the global avenues for his businesses were shrinking, so the walls were kind of closing in on Russian capital abroad.
Exactly. So he went home. He is deeply, deeply embedded in the reality of the country right now.
Which makes you wonder, what drives a guy like that to risk literally everything by speaking out?
Well, it comes down to a pragmatic panic. Melnichenko and his peers, they're realizing they can no longer just ignore a system that is rapidly degrading around them.
Yeah.
The autocracy they relied on for all that stability, it's descending into this volatile tyranny that threatens their actual survival.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to try and visualize the mechanics of this degrading system. So instead of thinking of the Russian state as like a failing corporation or a sinking ship, think of the Russian economy as a massive high-performance engine.
Okay, I like that.
Right. So for years, the oligarchs basically owned the engine, the Kremlin drove the car, and everybody was happy.
Right.
But now, because of the war, the Kremlin is literally cannibalizing parts of that engine just to keep the car moving forward. I mean, they're ripping out the alternator to fix the radiator.
Yeah, exactly.
And the car's still running, which is why we don't see an immediate collapse. But anyone who understands how the machine works knows that catastrophic failure is basically inevitable if they don't pull over.
What's fascinating here is that this is a much more accurate way to understand the tension. Melnichenko is looking at the internal mechanics and he's realizing the whole vehicle is heading for insolvency.
Yeah.
And this directly contradicts the narrative Vladimir Putin is feeding the public, right? Putin promises the military operation is under control, a breakthrough is imminent.
But the reality inside Russia tells a very different story. The war has undeniably come home.
It really has. And the article gives concrete evidence of how that cannibalization is affecting daily life. Like, take the Crimean Peninsula.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah.
If you remember back to 2014, the annexation of Crimea was Putin's crown jewel.
Absolutely.
It was this massive geopolitical victory, sent his approval ratings through the roof. It projected absolute strength.
Yet today, the psychology around Crimea has entirely flipped. The article details how Ukrainian drone strikes are actively isolating the peninsula.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. What was once the ultimate symbol of Russian invulnerability is now this glaring, exposed weakness.
And that vulnerability is trickling down to the most basic levels of civilian life. I mean, we are talking about physical fistfights breaking out at filling stations across Russia.
Just people waiting in massive queues for fuel.
Which, think about the irony of that for a second. You are a citizen of one of the world's most dominant energy superpowers, and you literally cannot get gas for your car.
Yeah, and that happens because targeted attacks on Russian oil refineries have just severely disrupted their internal supply chains.
Because it doesn't matter how much crude oil is in the ground if the facility that refines it into gasoline is offline.
Exactly. The state cannot insulate its people from those logistical breakdowns anymore.
And beyond the economic stuff, the human cost is hitting a critical threshold. We're talking forced military enlistment, pulling regular citizens.
Teachers, factory workers, fathers.
Yeah, just pulling them out of their lives. It is no longer this distant television war fought by professionals. It's breeding active resentment. I mean, the article points out that even popular influencers are airing their complaints online.
And those complaints are going viral before the state censors can even scrub them.
Right.
So all of these factors, they combine to create this profound psychological shift. Like we noted with your engine analogy, the Russian economy isn't going to implode tomorrow morning.
No, we're not seeing 1 million people marching on Red Square.
But there is a pervasive, suffocating feeling just settling over the population. The phrase they use in the article is that the country has hit a dead end.
The dead end.
Yeah, it's this collective realization that the current trajectory offers zero prospect for future growth or stability, just endless grinding friction.
And, when you feel trapped in a dead end, you start desperately looking at the possible exits. So Melnichenko lays out his forecasts for where this road ultimately leads. And looking at his 3 long-term scenarios, there isn't a single optimistic outcome.
No, not one.
But before we map those out, we kind of have to address his immediate short-term fear, which is the threat of severe escalation.
Right, because the historical reflex for an autocrat who feels backed into a corner.
Facing domestic fatigue, a stalled military campaign.
Exactly. The reflex is to execute something spectacular to break the deadlock. If current force levels aren't achieving the goal, the instinct is to multiply the force. And Melnichenko explicitly fears that Putin might resort to using a tactical nuclear weapon.
Which is just a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
The logic being that a strike like that would shock and terrorize Ukraine's European backers into instantly folding.
Yes, demanding a truce. Now, Western intelligence analysts, they generally discount the likelihood of that happening.
Because of the massive geopolitical blowback, right, from
Yeah.
allies like China.
Exactly. But the fact that Russia's top industrialist is actively verbally worrying about it, that demonstrates how volatile the internal calculus has really become.
Yeah.
And Melnichenko argues that even if Putin escalates, even if he uses extreme domestic repression and terrifying weapons, it won't manufacture a lasting peace.
It just triggers another, more dangerous cycle of alarm and retaliation.
Yeah.
So, since escalation just digs the hole deeper, what are the actual long-term endpoints for Russia? Melnichenko maps out 3 highly specific scenarios.
Let's hear them.
Scenario 1 is total anarchy and collapse. In this nightmare, the central state structure dissolves completely. You're left with regional warlords fighting over the country's vast natural resources, and worst of all, fighting for control over loose nuclear stockpiles.
It is the ultimate state failure scenario.
Yeah.
But we also have to look at his second scenario, which is the foreign vassal state. So instead of collapsing internally, the Russian state survives, but it is entirely subjugated by an external power.
Like China.
Most likely, yeah. It becomes dominated by China, serving functionally as a massive resource-rich buffer zone against the West. Or alternatively, after years of this grinding war of attrition, Russia shrinks into an impoverished, isolated dependent existing on the extreme periphery of Europe.
Right. And then the third scenario is essentially North Korea 2.0. So Russia turns into a closed fortress. It starves itself of foreign capital and economic growth, locking its population into a state of permanent mobilization and endless war against the outside world.
And the really chilling detail here is that the article explicitly notes this fortress model is actively being discussed as a viable option inside the Kremlin right now.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I want to push back on something regarding that first scenario, anarchy and collapse.
Okay.
You read that and you think, wait, isn't the threat of a collapsed, fractured, nuclear-armed Russia actually Vladimir Putin's ultimate geopolitical shield?
Ah.
Because the article itself mentions that the Biden administration has been really hesitant to fully humiliate Russia precisely because they fear the consequences of loose nukes and warlords.
Yeah.
So is Melnichenko genuinely terrified of anarchy? Or is he just shrewdly weaponizing the West's worst nightmare to try and force them to the negotiating table?
That is a very sharp distinction to make. And honestly, it's highly likely he is utilizing that fear strategically, accept our terms or deal with the abyss.
Right.
But we have to look at the mechanics of why he fears all 3 of these scenarios. Let's look at the vassal state outcome. Why would that be a disaster for someone like him?
Well, why?
Because historical Russian pride, combined with subservience to Beijing, is a recipe for deep, violent nationalist resentment. It guarantees internal instability.
Okay, what about the North Korea model then? If you're an oligarch, you technically survive in a fortress state, right? I mean, you just run the fortress.
You survive, but your capital doesn't grow. The mechanics of a North Korea model require total economic autarky.
Meaning the country has to rely entirely on itself.
Exactly, and it demands a state of permanent global tension to justify the immense security apparatus required to keep those borders closed. So if you're a billionaire whose wealth depends on global markets, fertilizer exports, international supply chains...
A closed fortress totally destroys your empire.
Yes. Melnichenko needs integration and predictability. All three of these scenarios, anarchy, vassalage, and fortress, they fundamentally destroy predictability.
So he doesn't want a Mad Max wasteland, he doesn't want to be a middleman for Beijing, and he certainly doesn't want to be trapped in a giant North Korea.
Right.
Which leads us to his proposed solution. How do we avoid those outcomes? He essentially urges Western countries to stop pushing the war to its absolute limits and find a way to coexist with Russia. But his central demand hinges on one very loaded word, which is sovereignty.
And that is a critical concept to unpack. When Melnichenko demands the West grant Russia sovereignty, he is not just talking about border integrity.
Yeah.
He is using it in the same diplomatic context that China uses the phrase non-interference.
Oh.
It is a demand for absolute immunity. He's telling the West, you must allow us to operate our state internally however we see fit, without imposing sanctions, moral judgments, or economic penalties.
But at the exact same time, he argues that the Russian leadership needs to become predictable to the outside world and that they need to win over the Russian people without using coercion, meaning the state can't just throw every political dissident into a penal colony.
Correct.
Yeah.
He's implicitly suggesting that the current model of one-man rule has to end.
Right.
Because one-man rule, by its very nature, relies on coercion and is inherently unpredictable. One person can wake up and decide to invade a neighbor. A broad coalition of technocrats wouldn't make that same impulsive choice.
So what does this all mean? Let me stop you there, because we really need to interrogate his motives here.
Go for it.
If he is demanding non-interference from the global community, but he is fundamentally avoiding the word democracy.
Which the article highlights he never actually says.
Right, he never says. So isn't he just basically asking the West to drop the sanctions so the oligarchs can go back to making money, entirely free from pesky human rights complaints?
Yeah.
It sounds like he wants all the financial benefits of the liberal global market without adopting a single liberal domestic value. He wants a predictable oligarchy, not a free society.
I wouldn't disagree with that assessment at all. It is a highly cynical, self-serving position. He basically desires a technocratic autocracy, a system that is stable enough for capital to flow smoothly, but where the general public still doesn't hold actual democratic power.
Right.
However, if we connect this to the bigger picture, even this halfway self-serving reform faces a monumental institutional roadblock inside Russia right now. And this is where we have to clarify who actually holds power in the Kremlin today. We throw around terms like oligarchs and technocrats.
But we need to understand the securocrats.
That's a sec.
Okay, let's define the players on the board. You have the oligarchs, like Melnichenko. These are the billionaire industrialists. They own the factories, the mines, the wealth.
Then you have the technocrats. These are the highly educated managers, the economists, central bankers. They don't own the wealth, but they manage the spreadsheets. They keep the monetary policy functioning.
And finally, the securocrats.
The securocrats are the men with the guns.
Right.
They are drawn from the intelligence services, the FSB, the military, the hardline state security apparatus. When Putin consolidated power over the last 2 decades, he systematically pushed the original 1990s billionaires out of the political sphere and replaced them with these securocrats.
Right.
They are the ultimate enforcers, and they currently run the country.
And here's the core conflict. The power, wealth, and influence of those securocrats are completely dependent on a militarized, antagonistic Russia. If the country is at war or constantly threatened by the West, the security services are the most important people in the room. They get all the funding.
But if Russia normalizes, if it becomes that predictable, business-friendly, non-coercive environment that Melnichenko is advocating for,
the securocrats lose their reason for existing.
Their power evaporates. Therefore, Melnichenko is placing an incredibly dangerous bet. He's publicly signaling a hope that the technocrats who manage the economy and the oligarchs who own the industry can somehow unite to counterbalance the securocrats who control the military and the police.
He is basically hoping that people who control the bank accounts can overpower the people who control the state violence.
Yes.
Which is just a terrifying internal conflict to attempt to ignite. And Putin is caught right in the middle. I mean, the article notes that grinding on what the war costs him, escalating costs him, but attempting to reform the system might literally cost him his life.
And to understand how a power struggle between industrialists and the security state might actually play out, the article draws on a really fascinating historical precedent.
Yeah.
Because this exact tension is over a century old. We have to look at the events of 1905.
Right, during the Russo-Japanese War.
Exactly. Russia fought a 19-month war against Japan and suffered a humiliating, crushing defeat. It completely shattered the illusion of Russian imperial invincibility.
Yeah.
And in the aftermath of that shock, the industrialists and technocrats of 1905, they looked at the economic wreckage and realized that dictatorial rule under Tsar Nicholas II was fundamentally incompatible with modernization.
Because one-man rule was rigid and inefficient.
Right. It was dooming Russia to lag behind Europe. So the business elite essentially did what Melechenko is trying to do today. They blamed the autocrat.
And they actually forced his hand. Following massive labor strikes and uprisings, the industrialists compelled Tsar Nicholas II to sign the October Manifesto.
Which was huge.
It was a landmark document. It granted civil liberties and created a legislative assembly called the Duma. It officially devolved power away from the absolute monarch.
But we have to look at the mechanics of why that reform failed. Because by 1907, just 2 years later, Nicholas had crushed those concessions.
Right.
He didn't just tear up the paper. He used his control over the military to suppress uprisings. He unilaterally changed electoral laws to ensure the assembly was filled with his loyalists. And he systematically fractured the opposition coalition.
He clawed all the absolute power back.
He did, and the ultimate lesson is what happened a decade later. Because he refused lasting reform in 1905, he was violently toppled in the 1917 revolution, and the entire system was swept away.
It's a really compelling historical parallel. But we have to ask if 1905 is actually a useful roadmap for today. I mean, Tsar Nicholas II did not have a 21st century digital surveillance apparatus.
No, he did not.
He didn't have algorithmic state media controlling the narrative on millions of smartphones. He didn't have facial recognition cameras covering every intersection in Moscow. Can modern technocrats, armed with literally nothing but spreadsheets and economic anxiety, actually force the hand of a modern securocracy that completely controls the digital and physical public square?
This raises an important question because the modern tools of repression are terrifyingly efficient, it's true. The state can identify and isolate dissenters before a protest even organizes. But the core vulnerability remains exactly the same. You cannot mandate economic reality through a camera lens. State media propaganda cannot magically refine gasoline when the supply chains are broken. A surveillance algorithm cannot manufacture microchips.
You can arrest a dissident, but you cannot arrest a collapsing currency.
Exactly. The securocrats may hold all the physical power, but the state relies entirely on the technocrats and the industrialists to fund that power. If the economy seizes up, the war machine stops.
Yeah.
The crucial takeaway from the 1905 precedent is that half measures and temporary reprieves designed just to protect the elite, they do not work. If Russia only pauses the conflict to rebuild its military, or if it just quietly replaces one autocrat with a slightly more polite oligarchy, the underlying rot remains.
The cycle of tyranny, stagnation, and eventual collapse will just simply repeat itself.
Right. The hope is that the systemic pressures force reforms that actually endure.
Which really leaves us with a truly lingering thought. We just spent this time analyzing Andrei Melnichenko, a man who broke the golden rule to speak out for 60 hours. But if an ultimate protected insider like him is willing to be this vocal about the undeniable rot inside the system, try to imagine the sheer panic among the elites who aren't talking.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine the desperate conversations happening behind closed doors that we will never even hear. It leaves you wondering, if change actually does come to Russia, driven by this immense internal pressure, will it truly be for the everyday people enduring the fuel queues and the forced military drafts? Or will it just be a quiet, ruthless reshuffling of the billionaires at the very top, designed solely to save their own empires? Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs. And don't forget to like, comment, and share.